The end of the First World War and the establishment of the Weimar Republic brought about some of the most profound social and cultural changes to Germany. And that's what we're going to do in this lesson in terms of examination. We are going to examine the Weimar period, and we're going to look at the different social developments, the effect of the war on German society, the social and cultural changes that we see in Weimar Germany during this time. So, the first thing that we're going to think about is the social effect of World War I. Now, the First World War had a transformative impact on German society, as you can probably imagine. Not only was there hardship as the result of loss of life, which we'll get to in a minute, but we also have the fact that the German society and the First World War reshaped class structures, gender roles, and social attitudes during this period. The first point that we can make is that approximately 2 million German soldiers were killed during the First World War, and approximately over 4 million were wounded. This left a generation of widows, orphans, and disabled veterans dependent on government support, all of which caused a strain in terms of the economy. In addition to this, food shortages caused by the Allied blockade, combined with war-related inflation, led to a widespread hunger and hardship, particularly among the working classes. For example, between 1916 and 1917, the winter period of those years was known as the Turnip Winter, because it was exemplifying that of the severe deprivation during that period. The war deepened divisions within different social classes. While industrialists would profit from wartime production, many workers, by contrast, faced exploitation, and the middle class saw their savings eroded by the growing and creeping influence of inflation. Furthermore, we see there's an impact on gender roles as the result of the First World War. It brought women into industries that were traditionally dominated by men. This includes things like munitions factories, because men were conscripted into the army, and so the women had to take up the roles of being the industrialists that the men once were. This challenged pre-war gender norms, but it also created a tension when men returned from the front and sought to reclaim their jobs that were now taken by women. And in addition to this, despite wartime contributions, women were expected to return to these traditional domestic roles after the war, often leading to frustration and a growing feminist movement. Now, this isn't a phenomenon that is unique to just Germany, and it is not a phenomenon that is unique to just the First World War. Both World War I and II, and including Great Britain, America, and Germany and other countries, experienced this wave of feminist movement because of the fact that women were then expected to step up, and so it led to things like women's rights, women's suffrage, and greater expansion of the role of the woman in traditionally men working environments. Furthermore, we have the fact that there was this idea of the, quote, lost generation. Many returning soldiers struggled to reintegrate into the civilian life. Many felt alienated and betrayed. They were betrayed by the perceived failure of the war effort. They felt betrayed by the politicians who had allegedly sold them out during the Treaty of Versailles. They had many not only physical but also mental disabilities as a result. Things like shell shock, things like PTSD, and many, obviously, actual physical conditions. Disillusioned veterans would often join paramilitary groups, such as the Freikorps. Now, these became a destabilizing force in Weimar politics, but they also perpetuated a culture of violence and militarism. So this is the impact of the war, and this is an impact that the Weimar Constitution inherited at the end of the First World War. And so the Weimar period itself was marked by both polarization in terms of society and in terms of culture, but also progress in certain regards. So, for example, there was a democratization of the electorate during this period. The Weimar Constitution enshrined legal equality for all citizens. It granted universal suffrage. including the voting rights for women, and it protected civil liberties such as freedom of speech and assembly. It presented a number of challenges to traditional social hierarchies. The collapse of the monarchy and the aristocrats and the aristocracy's diminished influence allowed for greater social mobility. This is the case despite the fact that the old elites still remained in quite significant economic and cultural power. Let's not get it twisted. It wasn't a major social mobility revolution. It was still nevertheless one that was dominated by aristocrats and people of the old guard, of the old elite. In addition to the institutional or the constitutional changes to the German society, there were also new opportunities for women. Women gained the right to vote and to access higher education as well as professional careers. And we can see that by the late 1920s, by around 1928, 1929, women made up nearly 35% of the workforce, particularly in white-collar jobs such as office work and teaching. And so within the urban areas, we see the emergence of what becomes known as the, quote, new woman, characterized by greater independence, shorter hairstyles, and the rejection of traditional gender norms. This was, of course, met with backlash from conservative and traditional segments of society, but it was also welcomed by those who were more progressive. Urbanization and class division was also a major issue that became prevalent as a societal change. Cities like Berlin became centers of innovation and cultural experimentation. The rapid growth of urban areas also highlighted, however, that there was class inequalities, as working class families would often live in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. But despite economic recovery in the mid-1920s, we still see many workers struggling. We still see that they face low wages and that they face poor working conditions. The labour movement remained strong, with trade unions and the Democratic Party, the SDP, advocating for workers' rights, but the actual conditions and the actual results were still relatively limited. When we think about the younger parts of German society, the interwar period saw a distinctive rise in youth culture. This was a culture that was characterized by greater leisure time, as well as new forms of entertainment, such as the introduction of cinema and jazz music, as well as the rejection of traditional values. We'll get to things like culture and cinema in a minute. The Weimar government also introduced reforms to help improve access to education and promote democratic values, but it was still nevertheless the case that despite these efforts, the schools would often remain divided along class and also along religious lines. In terms of cultural changes during the Weimar Republic, it became a hub, the Weimar system. Weimar Germany became a hub of cultural innovation. It earned the reputation as one of the most dynamic periods in modern European history. This was characterized as a golden age of culture, particularly being evident in urban centers like Berlin. We see, when looking at things like art and literature, movements such as Expressionism, artists such as Otto Dix and George Grosz using their works to critique the brutality of war, to critique social inequality and political corruption. Expressionist art then conveyed emotional intensity and societal anxieties. Some of the most impactful pieces of culture related to that of literature. So, for example, writers like Erich Maria Remarque introducing works and authorship such as the work All Quiet on the Western Front, which was originally, I believe, a book or a play that was then characterized in cinema at various different stages throughout history. But what All Quiet on the Western Front did was capture the disillusionment of the post-war generation. Other notable authors included people like Thomas Mann and Bertolt Brecht, both who explored themes of modernity and social change. In terms of cinema, we see that Weimar Germany becomes a world leader in innovative filmmaking. So influential films such as Fritz Lang's Metropolis and F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu became very key influences within this period. These films combined technical innovation with important social commentary. There was also the rise of this idea of political theatre. So people like Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill pioneered the idea of, quote, epic theatre, using their plays to challenge audiences and to address political and social issues. Within architecture and design, we see the introduction of something known as the Bauhaus movement, founded by Walter Gropius in 1919. The Bauhaus school emphasized functional, modern design and sought to integrate art, craft, and technology together. Its influence extended to architecture, to furniture, and to graphic design. There was also this idea known as urban modernism. These were the embracing of new materials and new styles within architecture, transforming cities with functionalist and minimalist designs. Then finally, we have music and entertainment. So the idea of the jazz and the cabaret. Berlin became a center for jazz music, symbolizing cultural freedom and decadence of the Weimar era, or at least allegedly decadence according to those who saw a backlash against this. You have classical composers such as Paul Heydemuth and Arnold Schoenberg, experimenting and thinking about artistic and musical ideas such as atonality and other modernist techniques, challenging traditional music conventions. Those of you who ever studied GCSE music, as I did many years ago, will be familiar with Arnold Schoenberg, because that's one of the key compositions that you have to study. And one of the key features of Schoenberg's work is this idea of atonality, and so that's a nice little reference there for you. So there's a lot of cultural changes and developments that we see, and it was a vibrant Weimar culture. But German society still, as a result of this, remained deeply divided, and there was significant opposition to these social changes. One such example was the conservative backlash, and rural and religious communities, particularly Protestants in the north and Catholics in the south, resisted the perceived moral decline of the urban areas and the idea of cultural liberalism within the Weimar Republic. Many Germans, especially conservatives and former elites, longed for the stability and hierarchy of the imperial era. It was viewed as weak and decadent, and all of this was as a result of this sort of rise in culture. Furthermore, we see class tensions. The middle class was devastated by hyperinflation, and they felt alienated by the Republic's perceived focus on workers' interests. This discontent fueled support for extremist parties like the NSDAP. And while the economy improved in the mid-1920s, the working class Germans continued to struggle with low wages and inadequate housing. This all leads to, of course, the expansion and the development of extremist groups. The stark contrast between the progressive urban culture and the conservative rural values heightened tensions. Extremist groups on both the left and the right exploited these divisions, and the Weimar Republic was accused of failing to uphold traditional German values.